Hello everyone, this is the Mind of Lilith, and thank you for joining me for a quick astrological analysis of Henry Kissinger's natal chart. Today I'm going to explore Kissinger's psychological profile, his trauma, his motivations, and his impact on the world around him. But before I begin the chart delineation, I'm going to explain why Kissinger was such a controversial figure. So Henry Kissinger was the U.S. National Security Advisor from 1969 to 1975, and he was the U.S. Secretary of State from 1973 to 1977 during the Nixon administration. The National Security Advisor is the President's senior aide and advisor for national security concerns. The National Security Advisor is provided with classified intelligence that he must analyze and then present to the President, like the Mafia has a consigliere. The National Security Advisor is the head of the National Security Council. The U.S. National Security Council was created in 1947 at the outset of the Cold War to protect the economic interests of the U.S. government and corporations. So the National Security Council is responsible for managing the Pentagon, foreign conflicts, intelligence, and international economic policy. And the basis of U.S. international economic policy is protecting the interests of multinational corporations that are always looking for cheap resources, cheap labor, and new markets to sell their goods and services, which is why the U.S. military has bases on every continent. So the National Security Council gave birth to the Department of Defense and the CIA. And this is the same CIA that smuggles drugs and guns into the U.S. and other parts of the world to destabilize tribes, nations, or political adversaries. So Henry Kissinger's job was to advise presidents on how to protect U.S. economic interests, both abroad and domestically. Kissinger was elected to this position during the Vietnam War, which was a hot war that erupted during the Cold War era of 1947 to, I believe it was 1991. So to sum it up quickly, the Cold War was a standoff between the USSR, which is communist, and the United States of America, which is capitalist. Communism is a socioeconomic system that nationalizes labor and resources. There is no class system. Everybody makes the same amount of money, and the state is trusted to ration out what its citizens need. This is one of the reasons why some Black Americans, like Paul Robeson, aligned with communism, because in the early 20th century, Black culture was more collectivist than individualistic. So in communist China, the government has control of all the corporations, no matter how large or small they are, even though China has hybridized communism and capitalism to an extent, which is why the West has allowed it to thrive to this point. Capitalism, on the other hand, is a socioeconomic system that privatizes labor and resources. Individual people and businesses control land, labor, and other resources that are used for production of goods and services. You can think of the Walton family that owns Walmart, or Jeff Bezos who owns Amazon, or Mark Zuckerberg who owns Facebook. These are individual people who own multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. On the other hand, you may hear of, Fidel Castro or Hugo Chavez, who was the president of socialist Venezuela, and who happened to die from an aggressive form of cancer in 2013 after I suspect that he was poisoned. So capitalists hate communists because they feel like it hinders economic growth and technological development, which de-incentivizes the labor that they need to facilitate the stratification of social classes, which are based on wealth and income. This is one of the reasons why slavery was abolished, because it was kind of communist. You had, the slave masters who owned the plantations and who owned the output from the slave labor, but the slaves did not have the money to buy anything. They were provided all of their goods by the slave master. And because the slave masters were not inclined to be generous with their slaves, the slaves had little to nothing. They had no money to buy the things that the North was creating. So that was the purpose of the Civil War, not some morality that the Europeans certainly developed because of the plight of slavery. Slavery hindered capitalism, period. So capitalists hate socialism and communism because they feel like it de-incentivizes or hinders the labor force. In the capitalist mind, people will work less if they are not afraid to starve because the state or the government will provide food for them. So again, capitalism facilitates the stratification of these social classes, which are based on wealth and income and resource acquisition. And we can see the evidence of this stratification when the wealthy are allowed to hoard hundreds of billions or millions of dollars that they then use to buy dozens of mansions on multiple continents, while telling the working poor that they should live in tiny homes and pods to stop climate change. So communism is more collectivist and capitalism is more individualistic. Capitalists want to maximize profits by any means necessary, including going to war to create new markets for multinational corporations. And this brings me to the Vietnam War. To sum it up, the Vietnam War was waged to stop communism from taking control of Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. So the U.S. military sent young American men into the jungles of Vietnam to be slaughtered and to slaughter innocent victims to protect corporate interests in the region. Now, keep in mind that corporate interests are usually protected by the military. The military-industrial complex is an industry that ensures corporations have access to cheap oil, cheap minerals, cheap labor, and markets to sell their products, which are polluting the earth. So essentially, the military and corporations are forcing poor workers to buy things that pollute the earth, and then they blame climate change on these same poor people. So the Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975, almost 20 years, and it was a political disaster because the Vietnamese put in work, and American men came back maimed, traumatized, disillusioned, and addicted to drugs. So now this brings me to Kissinger. The Vietnam War could have ended in 1969, but as the National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State, Kissinger advised Nixon to extend the war to secure the presidential election. Furthermore, under the counsel of Kissinger, Nixon authorized the U.S. military to secretly bop 500,000 tons of bombs on neighboring Cambodia between 1965 and 1973 to stop the Vietnamese from transporting military supplies through Cambodia. This is like the U.S. government bombing New Jersey to stop people from traveling through New Jersey to get to New York to give supplies to people fighting here. So in summary, Kissinger went on a scorched earth campaign to protect the interests of the U.S. government, and Nixon was dumb enough, paranoid enough, and drunk enough to be manipulated into executing the Machiavellian plans of a sociopath. At the end of this chapter, Nixon was impeached, but Kissinger was elevated to a Yoda-like status and given a Nobel Peace Prize after orchestrating the deaths of millions of innocent civilians in Southeast Asia, including Pakistan. As a side note, Kissinger was reported to be a Zionist. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but he was reported to be a Zionist who hated Jews. And interestingly enough, the U.S. government brought in thousands of German Nazi military scientists and personnel after World War II to help the U.S. develop biological weapons and military technology that the U.S. could use to spread democracy throughout the world. So our government has been controlled by both Zionists and Nazis for the past 70 years. How's that for irony, right? The Nazis want perpetual warfare. This is why they appropriated the symbol for peace, which is the swastika. It came from Buddhist culture. They appropriated it and they turned it 90 degrees. So when occultists bastardize or they corrupt a symbol of something, they turn it at an angle, they turn it upside down, and this is done to corrupt the energy of the symbol. So in its proper position, the swastika represents peace, but when turned at a 90-degree angle, it now represents war. This is similar to Black American music being used to promote the same capitalism that has been used to destroy their culture and the world. I'm going to dig deeper into that in another podcast. So with all that background information, it is time to dig into Kissinger's chart. According to Astro.com, Henry Kissinger was born on May 27, 1923, in Fürth, Germany at 5:30 in the morning. He died at 100 years old on November 29, 2003, right after the full moon in Gemini. So for this analysis, I'm going to focus on how the trauma Kissinger experienced during his formative years as a Jew living in Nazi Germany influenced his personality and his worldview. So let's start with Kissinger's fourth house of ancestry, the home, the family, the past, and the mother. Kissinger has an exalted Saturn in Libra conjunct the moon in the 4th house. Saturn in the 4th house is usually uncomfortable for the native. The native may grow up in a loveless household that is emotionally repressive. The person feels trapped or afraid in their home. The Saturn-Moon conjunction indicates that his parents were from the same culture, race, nationality, or tribe. The mother was dutiful, yet dependent on the strength and the provision of the father. Now, Saturn is a malefic, just like Mars, and malefics tend to have a negative influence on the house that they're in. The energy of Saturn causes isolation, loss, or separation from whatever house it's in. And in Kissinger's case, since Saturn was in his 4th house, he and his family ended up self-deporting to the U.S. to escape Nazi Germany. It is safe to assume that moving to New York City from Germany was a very difficult yet necessary transition for Kissinger and his family, and this affected him tremendously. The moon conjunct Saturn in this case represents someone who has been separated from their homeland and as a result has repressed emotions of grief, anger, resentment, and a sense of injustice. And this brings me to Kissinger's 1st house. The 1st house is the house of personality, physical appearance, first impressions, and how you relate to others. Kissinger has Mars and Pluto in the 1st house, which indicates that traumatic childhood experiences have shaped his identity and personality. With Mars and Pluto in the 1st house, Kissinger had a scorpionic temperament. He was secretive, perceptive, easily angered, manipulative, and paranoid. So why was he this way? Well, Kissinger was a Jew who was born into Nazi Germany right after World War I ended. I think World War I ended in 1918, and Kissinger was born 5 years after that, or 4 or 5 years after that. So, he was at the mercy of stronger and more deadlier forces that he readily encountered while he was growing up. He was bullied and beaten as a teenager, but he was also at the mercy of unseen forces, like the rise of the Third and Fourth Reich and the subsequent Holocaust. Pluto represents transformation and metamorphosis after crisis or tragedy, and Pluto in the 1st house gives the native an impending sense of danger and doom. There are enemies behind every corner, ghouls and goblins behind every shadow, and this placement gives people heightened perception and an intuitive insight into people's minds and motivations, because if you are surrounded by the threat of imminent danger or death, and you cannot identify the source of that anxiety, then you become paranoid, assuming that everyone has the ability to hurt or betray you. And this is a self-defense mechanism. Pluto in the 4th house is like someone being born in a dangerous neighborhood full of gangs and guns and crime and drugs and death. The native may not be the specific target of the danger, but the air has become electrified with the possibility that your environment will have a negative impact on your health and well-being. So although Kissinger's Sun and Mercury are in the 12th house of Gemini, they still share the same sign as his Mars on the ascendant. In fact, the dispositor of Kissinger's Mars is also the dispositor of Kissinger's Sun. In astrology, the Sun is the ego identity of the individual. It is indicative of one's focus, their life purpose, and their aspirations. With the synergy between Mars, Pluto, Mercury, and the Sun, Kissinger was focused on using his power to protect himself from imminent danger. I would not be surprised if after all the beatings and the threats and the violence and the abuse, discrimination, humiliation, and then exile, I wouldn't be surprised at some point if Kissinger made a vow to himself that he will never be a helpless victim again. So with this Mars and Gemini conjunct Pluto in Cancer, he used the power of his intellect to project an image of himself that was all-powerful, omniscient, and dangerous even. He became Machiavellian, doing everything in his power to protect the helpless child within him who was bullied and forced to leave his homeland. So although Kissinger played soccer as a child, he wasn't some supreme muscular athlete fighter. He was kind of a nerd. So if a nerd can't use their fists or their muscles to win a battle, what else could they use? They can use their mind. This is also very scorpionic. Mars represents both Aries and Scorpio, but Mars in Aries is more so direct conflict, while Scorpio is more subtle. It is strategic. It's hidden. Mars in Aries doesn't mind getting their face cracked, but Mars and Scorpio will try to avoid getting their face cracked by developing a deep understanding of their opponent. So this is how Kissinger was able to maneuver himself into positions of power. Kissinger has Mars in Gemini, so he weaponized his intellect against everyone, including people who were incompetent, like Richard Nixon. Powerful people in government tend to hire intelligent individuals to think for them, which made Kissinger all the more powerful because he was able to hypnotize Nixon and other individuals that he counseled into seeing the world from his perspective. Pluto in the first house can give someone a powerful or magnetic aura that commands attention and respect, no matter how small or nerdy the person is. I have Pluto conjunct my sun in Scorpio, and people for some reason act intimidated around me, no matter how pleasant I am around them. So Kissinger had a formidable presence that elicited strong emotions from people for better or worse. He had the ability to use his language to persuade wealthier and more prominent people to do his bidding. And this brings me to the Sun and Mercury in the 12th house of secrets, deception, the unconscious, and illusion. People with this placement use duplicitous language to hide their machinations and their motives. Kissinger's identity was hidden behind Mars and Pluto. While he presented himself as a strong, powerful man, he was actually a frightened, paranoid narcissist who believed that the end justified the means. He was determined to protect himself by any means necessary, including using lies and deception, and pretending to defer to the authority of less intelligent and less competent people like Richard Nixon. One of the 48 laws of power is never to outshine the king. In spite of his power and prominence, Kissinger never outshined Nixon, even allowing Nixon to spew anti-Semitic rhetoric around him. And Kissinger also expressed contempt for Jews, but I think it was because he felt like Jews were weaklings who didn't have the power to protect themselves from Nazis. And sometimes people who are bullied, they become bullies themselves. They identify with the bullies, hence the Zionists. It has also not escaped me that Zionist Israel has developed some sort of parasitic influence on the U.S. government to assert its own power. I mean, Israel does not have to become a superpower as long as they have control of the U.S. government and its foreign policy. It has not escaped me that after the U.S. government was infiltrated by both Nazis and Zionists, that the brown developing world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East has been on fire consistently in order to spread democracy by way of capitalistic exploitation of natural resources and human labor. So back to Kissinger. Kissinger again has Mars in Gemini conjunct Pluto in Cancer, square Saturn, and Libra. This is very nasty. Nasty, 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 nasty. Okay, we have three malefics fighting for supremacy. And in astrology, Cancer represents the homeland, the nation, the mother, the matriarchy, feelings or emotional needs. Pluto represents crisis and transformation, and Mars represents war and violence, and Saturn represents tragedy, oppression, and torture. With Pluto in Cancer conjunct Mars, Kissinger had both fierce nationalism, but with the square to Saturn, there was a brutal disregard for innocent women, children, family, and villages. As I mentioned earlier, Kissinger sanctioned 500,000 tons of bombs, more than 500,000 tons of bombs, 500,000 tons of bombs to be dropped on innocent men, women, and children in Cambodia for years. And this was done in secret. So in Kissinger's mind, if he was not allowed to live in peace and comfort in his own homeland in Germany, then neither was anybody else. No one came to his family's rescue when they had to escape Europe, so he could care less about the well-being of innocent civilians in other parts of the world. And this quality of his personality is accentuated by Kissinger's Mercury retrograde in Gemini, as well as his Neptune square Jupiter placement, which I will discuss later. When someone has Mercury in retrograde, they may have a very high intellect, intuition, and instinct, but they don't have perspective on wisdom because they can only see things from their own point of view. But a lot of people are so impressed by the other positive aspects of the retrograde, the high intellect and skills, and being a polyglot or somebody really talented. These people tend to dismiss the arrogance of the Mercury retrograde combust sun person. Not only did Kissinger see things from his perspective, but he was basking in the glory of his intellect. He prided himself on how smart he was. So this brings me back to Mars in Gemini. Mars in Gemini gives someone a muscular or an athletic intelligence. These people have the ability to consume large quantities of information that gives them knowledge, but not necessarily Sagittarian wisdom. Mars in Gemini is the military strategist, someone who loves to think about war, talk about war, war politics, and the politics of war. So Kissinger was like a fish to water as Secretary of State. However, Kissinger's strategies were based on what ideology or belief system? I mentioned Machiavelli earlier. But let's look at Kissinger's Neptune in Leo and his Jupiter in Scorpio. So Neptune represents our morals and beliefs, and Jupiter represents wisdom that is informed by knowledge, but not idealism. Kissinger has Neptune in Leo square Jupiter in Scorpio. People with Neptune square Jupiter have an extremist or fundamentalist worldview, whether it's Nazism, Zionism, jihadism, evangelicism, or in Kissinger's case, consequentialism. Consequentialism basically dictates that morality is determined by favorable outcomes, regardless of the methods used to achieve those outcomes. With Neptune in Leo square Jupiter in Scorpio, Kissinger had a God complex that made him amoral. As long as he was allowed to use his ideologies to help others achieve their goals, he would be protected from the impact of those ideologies. Neptune and Jupiter can also be interpreted as false wisdom or wisdom that is cultivated by ideals but not facts. The wisdom is highly subjective and designed to further the agenda of the person who is the purveyor of said ideology. So in other words, Kissinger's political ideology was heavily influenced by the power of his intellect, not his wisdom, but his ability to consume and disseminate information and communicate information in a way that achieved his objectives and the objectives of the people who he was working for. In a nutshell, Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for facilitating the outsourcing of U.S. jobs to China, just like Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for allowing the U.S. government to continue plundering the Middle East for oil. They hired him to do a job and he was rewarded before he completed the mission. This is consequentialism. The morality is based on the effectiveness of the methodology. If the methodology is not effective, then it is not considered moral. It's wrong. So, that's creepy, weird, and sociopathic. And at some point, we have to realize that this world is controlled by psychopaths, and we should stop asking these people to validate us with their worthless awards. Okay? Now back to Kissinger. Why was Kissinger so comfortable with war, death, and brutality? Well, let's go back to these aspects between Pluto, Mars, and Saturn. In astrology, squares are disharmonious aspects that are expressed as a lack of integration of the energies of the planets and signs involved in the squares. This internal conflict manifests as external conflict repeatedly until you learn the lesson of that square, until you learn how to integrate the energies of the square. So in other words, the wars that Kissinger waged on the world and on other people were an outward manifestation of the wars that he had within himself. He was at war with his own feelings of fear, anger, chaos, and paranoia. So he had no problem inflicting fear, anger, chaos, and paranoia on the world around him, including the people in the White House. He was the reason for the Watergate scandal because he created a work environment where no one could trust each other. And so he and Nixon felt justified in illegally wiretapping everyone to cultivate a false sense of security. I mean, once you do that, you don't really feel safe anyway. And Kissinger was comfortable being uncomfortable. He was comfortable in environments where he felt unsafe, right? Kissinger was very bitter and angry and fearful because of his childhood, to the extent that he identified with the bullies instead of their victims. As a child, he hated feeling powerless and treated unjustly. So he used his position to make others feel powerless and to treat them unfairly. Now, the fact that he is so highly revered by the military and corporate elites should be enough evidence to prove that these corporate elites are also bitter, angry, and fearful of the slaves who they're using to fight their wars and buy their garbage. So like Kissinger's mind, we are kept in the perpetual cycle of instability and warfare, which benefits corporations and the military. Like the Vietnamese, the Bengalis, and the Cambodians, your families will be destroyed, not by bombs, but by the outsourcing of your jobs and your cultures to impoverished nations. And if you complain too hard, they will import millions of impoverished victims of the military-industrial complex to replace you in your schools, your communities, and your places of work. These culture wars are being instigated to corrode the national identity of the citizens so that we marry, have babies with, and we die for money and for stuff, not for our religious beliefs, not for our spouses or our families or our children. Capitalism is a vampire that either kills its host or it infects them with vampirism. Now you're in love with the very system that destroyed your culture, just as Kissinger fell in love with the dark forces that killed millions of people in the 20th century. So the reason why Kissinger is revered and exalted in some spaces is because he is one of the major architects of the New World Order, an order that seeks to enslave humanity through debt, through forced labor, through the exploitation of their natural resources in their land. Capitalism is economic extremism. This is why you have people with hundreds of billions of dollars on the same planet as people who make $1 per day, if that. And to make matters worse, they will blame you peons, you laborers, you slaves, for ruining the planet. They're going to tell you peons that you take up too much land. You buy too much stuff. You're the reason why the earth is polluted. At the same time, they are working relentlessly to pollute other parts of the earth with the same capitalistic ideology that will create more consumers. So they want more consumers to buy their goods and services. And these consumers will buy things that are in plastic bags and plastic bottles and boxes that pollute the oceans. And then they'll blame you for buying the crap that they're selling. They're going to blame you for them profiting off of your slavery. This is a reflection of the sociopathic mindset of capitalism. And when you marry capitalism with the military-industrial complex, which is, again, used to protect capitalism, then you will see what we have today. The destruction of family, of culture, of community. You know, every time I turn around, people are moving around. They're moving from state to state to state. Back in the day, family would live in the same state for 20, 30, 40 years in the same house. Now we have people moving every 3 or 4 years because it's too expensive where they live. They lose their jobs. They're not around. All right, guys, I'm sorry, but the audio got cut out for some reason. I tried to save the file and it got corrupted. I think it cut out at the part where I mentioned that the U.S. corporations are committing arson on different parts of the world to make way for these multi-billionaires and millionaires to buy real estate in places like Hawaii and Australia and in Brazil and, you know, in California, while they're telling you that you need to cut back and take up less space. They're not asking you to spend less money. They're asking you to take up less space so they can build bigger mansions for themselves and the other rich sociopaths and their friends and family circles. So I'm going to leave it there. I look forward to reading your feedback. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll speak to you soon.